Harold Jenkins was a man you wouldn't notice if you passed him in the hallway. He wasn't flashy or loud. He didn't demand attention. Instead, he moved quietly through the polished corridors of Harvard University, mop in one hand and a bucket in the other. At 70 years old, Harold had spent more than half his life cleaning up after some of the brightest minds in the world. Students hurried past him, their heads buried in textbooks or laptops, barely giving him a second glance. To them, he was just the janitor, the guy who emptied trash cans and wiped down chalkboards. But there was so much more to Harold than met the eye. Beneath his worn-out uniform and calloused hands lay a mind that sparkled with curiosity, a mind that loved numbers, patterns, and puzzles. As a boy growing up in rural Kentucky, Harold used to sit on the porch of his family's tiny wooden house, scribbling sums and equations in the dirt with a stick. Math came naturally to him, like breathing. It made sense when nothing else in. His chaotic childhood did. His father left when he was young, and his mother worked long hours at a diner to keep food on the table. Money was tight, but Harold found solace in the pages of an old algebra book someone had donated to the local library. That book became his escape, his secret treasure. Unfortunately, life had other plans for Harold. By the time he reached high school, his grades were good enough to earn him a scholarship to a nearby college. But dreams of higher education crumbled under the weight of reality. When his younger sister fell ill, Harold dropped out to take care of her and help his mom pay the bills. He took odd jobs working at gas stations, fixing fences, anything to make ends meet. The math books stayed tucked away on a shelf, gathering dust as years turned into decades. Eventually, Harold landed a job as a janitor at Harvard. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, and it allowed him to live close to Boston, where rents were sky high. Over the years, he learned the rhythms of the university, the early morning rush of students heading to class, the late-night cram sessions in dimly lit libraries, the constant hum of ambition filling every corner of the campus. Harold admired these young people chasing their dreams, even though he knew he'd never have the same chance. Still, he couldn't shake off his love for math. During lunch breaks, he'd pull out battered puzzle books from his backpack and lose himself in logic problems. Sometimes he'd sketch solutions on scraps of paper, tucking them away in his pocket like little secrets. One cold November evening, as winter began to creep into Massachusetts, Harold found himself alone in an empty lecture hall. Most of the students and professors had gone home, leaving behind only silence and rows of neatly arranged desks. Harold's task for the night was simple: clean the room, erase the chalkboards, and lock up before heading home. But as he approached the largest blackboard at the front of the room, something stopped him in his tracks. Scribbled across its surface were lines of complex equations, symbols, and diagrams. They looked foreign yet strangely familiar, like fragments of a language he once spoke fluently. Harold tilted his head, studying the board intently. These weren't just random doodles, they were advanced mathematical problems, likely left behind by graduate students working on research projects. Harold recognized bits and pieces of topology, a branch of math he dabbled in during his teenage years. Back then, he'd marveled at how shapes could twist and stretch without breaking apart, creating entirely new forms. Now, standing in front of this blackboard, those memories came rushing back. For a moment, Harold hesitated. Who was he to touch something so complicated? He wasn't a professor or a student, he was just a janitor. What business did he have meddling with equations meant for brilliant minds? But then again, no one else was here. The room was quiet, almost expectant, as if waiting for someone to step forward and solve the mystery written in chalk. Slowly, Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of chalk. He started tentatively at first, testing the waters. One number led to another. one symbol connected to the next. Before he knew it, Harold was fully immersed, his hand moving steadily across the board as if guided by an invisible force. Hours slipped away unnoticed. His shoulders ached and his fingers grew stiff, but he didn't stop. This wasn't just about solving a problem anymore. It was about rediscovering a part of himself he thought he'd lost forever. When Harold finally stepped back to look at what he'd done, his heart skipped a beat. The messy jumble of equations on the board now formed a coherent solution, elegant and precise. More than that, Harold realized he'd stumbled upon a shortcut, a simpler way to approach the problem that hadn't been considered before. For a brief moment, he felt like a kid again, sitting on that creaky porch in Kentucky, discovering the magic of numbers for the very first time. Little did Harold know, this act of curiosity would set off a chain reaction that would change not only his life but also the lives of countless others. All because one lonely janitor decided to pause and follow his instincts. The next morning, the lecture hall where Harold had spent hours working on the blackboard came alive with chatter. A group of graduate students filed in, their backpacks slung over their shoulders and coffee cups in hand. They were here to continue their research, picking up where they'd left off the previous day, but as they approached the board, their steps slowed down. The equations they'd been struggling with for weeks were no longer incomplete. Someone somehow had solved them. At first, the students thought it was a prank. Maybe one of their classmates had decided to mess with them, filling in random answers just to see their reactions. But as they looked closer, doubt turned into confusion. Whoever had written this solution wasn't playing around. The work was meticulous, logical, and most importantly, correct. It didn't just answer the problem, it offered a fresh perspective, simplifying steps that had seemed impossible before. One of the students, a tall guy with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, snapped a picture of the board with his phone. "This can't be right," he muttered under his breath. "Who even did this?" Another student shrugged. "Maybe Dr. Carter stopped by last night? She's always dropping hints about stuff like this." Dr. Evelyn Carter was a legend at Harvard, a brilliant mathematician known for her groundbreaking work in theoretical math. Her name carried weight, and if she had solved the problem, it would explain everything. But when the photo reached her inbox later that morning, she knew immediately that it wasn't her handwriting. Sitting at her desk, she studied the image carefully, her brow furrowing deeper with each passing second. What she saw wasn't just impressive, it was revolutionary. By lunchtime, whispers about the mysterious solution had spread across the department. Faculty members gathered in small clusters, debating who could have cracked such a complex problem. Some suggested it might be the work of a visiting scholar or perhaps an alumnus stopping by for nostalgia's sake. Others joked half seriously that aliens must have landed overnight and decided to leave their mark on a Harvard chalkboard. Amidst all the speculation, one question lingered. How did this happen? That afternoon, curiosity got the better of Dr. Carter. She decided to investigate further. Walking through the halls of the math building, she asked around, trying to piece together any clues about who might have been near the lecture hall the previous evening. One of the administrative staff mentioned seeing Harold, the janitor, cleaning nearby. At first, Dr. Carter dismissed the idea he was just doing his job after all. But something nagged at her. She remembered passing him once or twice late at night, noticing how he sometimes lingered near classrooms, almost as if he were studying the boards himself. Determined to get answers, Dr. Carter tracked down Harold. She found him mopping the floor in a quiet corner of the building, humming softly to himself. When she called out to him, Harold froze mid-motion, clearly startled. He turned slowly, his grip tightening on the mop handle. "Yes, ma'am?" he said, his voice polite but tinged with nervousness. "I need to ask you something." Dr. Carter began, Getting straight to the point. Were you in room 302 last night? Harold's face flushed red. For a moment, he considered lying, brushing it off as a misunderstanding. But then he remembered the thrill of solving the problem, the way it had felt to reconnect with a part of himself he thought he'd buried long ago. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. Yes, ma'am, I was there. Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Did you happen to write anything on the board? Harold hesitated. He didn't want to sound arrogant or foolish. After all, what business did a janitor have meddling with advanced mathematics? But there was no denying the truth. With a sheepish smile, he admitted, I may have tried my hand at it, just for fun. For fun? Dr. Carter repeated, her tone incredulous. She gestured toward the lecture hall. Come with me? Harold followed her, his heart pounding. As they entered the room, he saw the board exactly as he'd left it. The equations stared back at him, unchanged, perfect in their simplicity. Dr. Carter pointed to the solution. You did this? Yes, ma'am, Harold replied quietly. I hope I didn't cause any trouble. Trouble? Dr. Carter laughed, shaking her head. Do you have any idea what you've done here? This isn't just a solution, it's a breakthrough. She went on to explain how Harold's approach streamlined a process that researchers had been wrestling with for years. His method opened doors to new possibilities, offering insights that could reshape the field entirely. Harold listened in stunned silence. He'd never imagined his scribbles could mean so much. All his life, he'd kept his love for math hidden, believing it had no place in the real world. Now, standing in front of one of the greatest minds in academia, he realized he'd been wrong. Word of Harold's achievement traveled fast. By the end of the week, everyone in the math department knew about the janitor who had cracked an unsolvable problem. Students started seeking him out, peppering him with questions during his shifts. Some wanted to know how he'd figured it out. Others simply wanted to shake his hand. Harold handled the attention with grace, though he couldn't help feeling overwhelmed. For decades, he'd blended into the background, unnoticed and unremarkable. Now people looked at him differently, as someone extraordinary. One evening, Dr. Carter invited Harold to join her and a few colleagues for dinner. It was a casual gathering meant to celebrate the discovery and give Harold a chance to share his story. Over plates of pasta and glasses of wine, Harold spoke openly for the first time about his childhood, his passion for math, and the circumstances that had forced him to abandon his dreams. His honesty struck a chord with everyone present. Here was a man who had faced countless obstacles yet refused to let go of his love for learning. As the night wore on, Dr. Carter leaned forward, her expression serious. Harold, we need to publish this. Your work deserves recognition. Harold blinked, caught off guard. Publish it? You mean in a journal? Yes, she said firmly. And not just any journal, one of the top ones in the field. People need to see what you've accomplished. For the first time in years, Harold felt a spark of hope ignite within him. Maybe his journey wasn't over after all. Maybe, just maybe, it was only beginning. Harold couldn't sleep that night. The idea of publishing his work, a concept he'd never dreamed possible, kept replaying in his mind like a broken record. He lay on the thin mattress in his tiny apartment, staring at the cracked ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. For decades, he'd lived in the shadows, content with being invisible. Now suddenly, people were looking at him not as the janitor, but as someone who had something valuable to offer. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. The next morning, Harold arrived at Harvard earlier than usual. He wanted some time, alone to think, to process everything that had happened. As he pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the math building, he noticed a few students lingering near the bulletin board. They were whispering excitedly, pointing at a flyer that hadn't Been there the day before. Curious, Harold walked closer. His heart skipped a beat when he saw what it said, Meet the Mind Behind the Math, a special lecture by Harold Jenkins. He blinked, reading the words again to make sure he wasn't imagining things. Someone had organized an event around him. The lecture was scheduled for later that week, and apparently tickets were already selling out fast. Harold's stomach churned. Public speaking wasn't exactly his strong suit. He barely spoke above a mumble most days. How was he supposed to stand in front of hundreds of people and explain his solution? Before panic could take over, Dr. Carter appeared beside him, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to Harold with a warm smile. "Morning," she said cheerfully. "I see you've seen the news. This is real?" Harold asked, gesturing toward the flyer. "People are actually coming to listen to me?" "Of course they are," Dr. Carter replied, her tone matter of fact. "You've done something incredible, Harold. People want to hear your story, not just the math part, but everything that led you here. Trust me, you'll do great." Harold nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. Over the next few days, Dr. Carter helped him prepare for the lecture. Together they went over his notes, refining his explanations so they'd be easy for others to follow. She encouraged him to share personal anecdotes, reminding him that the audience would connect more with the man behind the equations than the numbers themselves. On the day of the lecture, Harold felt like he might throw up. He stood backstage, clutching a glass of water, listening to the murmur of voices filling the auditorium. When Dr. Carter gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder and whispered, "You've got this," Harold took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent as Harold approached the podium. Hundreds of faces stared back at him, their expressions curious and expectant. For a moment, he froze, unsure where to begin. Then he remembered Dr. Carter's advice, start with the truth. So he cleared his throat and began. "I'm not used to standing up here," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "Most days, I'm the guy mopping the floors or emptying trash cans. But tonight, I'm here to talk about something I've loved my whole life, math." From there, Harold opened up. He spoke about growing up poor in rural Kentucky, about how math became his escape from a tough childhood. He talked about dropping out of school to help his family, and how he'd carried his passion for numbers quietly through years of working odd jobs. He described the thrill of solving puzzles during lunch breaks and the bittersweet feeling of knowing he'd never have the chance to pursue his dream professionally. And finally, he explained how he'd stumbled upon the equation on the blackboard and decided to give it a try. As Harold spoke, the audience leaned forward, captivated. They laughed when he joked about almost getting caught writing on the board. "I thought for sure someone would accuse me of vandalism," and clapped when he demonstrated his simplified approach to the problem. By the end of the lecture, the room erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, cheering as if they'd witnessed something truly remarkable, which, in a way, they had. Afterward, dozens of attendees lined up to speak with Harold. Some thanked him for inspiring them to keep pursuing their passions, no matter the obstacles. Others asked questions about his methods, eager to learn more. A young woman with braces and a backpack told him she'd always struggled with math, but now saw it in a new light thanks to his explanation. "If you can figure this stuff out while mopping floors," she said with a grin, "then maybe I can too." That night, Harold left the university feeling lighter than he had in years. People weren't just acknowledging his intelligence. They were celebrating his resilience, his determination to hold on to his dreams despite everything life had thrown at him. For the first time, Harold allowed himself to believe that maybe he belonged in this world of academia. Even if he didn't fit the traditional mold. Over the following weeks, Harold's story spread far beyond Harvard's campus. Local newspapers picked it up, followed by national outlets. Journalists called him the accidental genius, marveling at how a humble janitor had solved a problem that baffled experts. Talk show hosts invited him to appear on their programs, and universities across the country reached out, offering honorary degrees and guest lectureships. Harold politely declined most of these offers, preferring to stay grounded in the life he knew. But there was one invitation he couldn't turn down: a request to co-author a paper with Dr. Carter. Working on the paper was unlike anything Harold had ever experienced. Every day he met with Dr. Carter and her team, diving deeper into the implications of his discovery. At first, he worried he wouldn't be able to keep up with the technical discussions, but the researchers quickly realized Harold brought something unique to the table: a fresh perspective untainted by conventional thinking. His unconventional methods challenged them to rethink long-held assumptions, leading to even more breakthroughs. When the paper was finally published, titled Reimagining Topological Solutions Through Simplicity, it sent shockwaves through the mathematical community. Scholars hailed it as a landmark achievement, crediting Harold for sparking a new wave of innovation in the field. For Harold, though, the greatest reward wasn't fame or recognition, it was the knowledge that he'd made a difference. His work proved that brilliance isn't limited to those with fancy titles or degrees. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to shine. Amidst all the excitement, Harold's newfound visibility also brought unexpected blessings. One of the most profound moments came when his estranged daughter reached out. Years earlier, Harold's relationship with her had fractured under the weight of misunderstandings and missed opportunities. After seeing him on television, she sent him a heartfelt letter, apologizing for the distance between them and expressing pride in everything he'd accomplished. Harold read the letter over and over, tears streaming down his face. For so long, he'd carried guilt and regret, wondering if he'd failed as a father. Now he had a second chance to rebuild what had been lost. As winter turned to spring, Harold settled into a rhythm of teaching, writing, and collaborating. Though he still worked as a janitor part-time, he dedicated more hours to mentoring students and giving talks at local schools. Kids especially loved hearing his story, often asking him to autograph their notebooks or pose for selfies. Harold embraced these interactions, knowing how much representation mattered. If his journey could inspire even one child to chase their dreams, then every struggle he'd endured would be worth it. Harold's transformation wasn't just personal, it rippled outward, touching lives in ways he couldn't have imagined. Teachers began incorporating his story into their lessons, using it as proof that success doesn't come from privilege or luck, but from perseverance and passion. Nonprofits launched initiatives aimed at supporting underprivileged students interested in STEM fields, naming scholarships after Harold. Even strangers stopped him on the street to thank him for proving that age and circumstance don't define potential. Through it all, Harold remained humble. Fame hadn't changed him. It had simply given him a platform to share the lessons he'd learned along the way. In interviews, he often said the same thing: life doesn't always go the way you plan, but that doesn't mean you stop trying. Sometimes your purpose finds you when you least expect it. And find him it did. From the quiet corridors of Harvard to the global stage, Harold Jenkins had gone from being unseen to unforgettable. Yet, at his core, he was still the same man who found joy in solving puzzles and peace in helping others. His story reminded everyone who heard it that greatness isn't about where you start, it's about what you choose to do with the hand you're dealt. As the months rolled on, Harold's life settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and entirely new. He still showed up at Harvard every morning, donning his janitorial uniform and pushing his trusty mop cart down the hallways. But now, people greeted him with genuine warmth. Students stopped to chat, professors waved hello, And even the security guards who used to nod politely but keep their distance started calling him by name. It wasn't just respect. It was admiration. Harold had become more than a janitor. He was a symbol of resilience, proof that brilliance could emerge from the most unexpected places. Despite all the attention, Harold stayed grounded. Fame hadn't gone to his head. In fact, he often joked that he felt like the same old guy who cleaned toilets for a living. The only difference, he'd say with a chuckle, is now I get invited to fancy dinners and have to wear a tie. Still, he couldn't deny how much his life had changed. For the first time, he felt seen not as someone who blended into the background, but as someone whose contributions mattered. One of the biggest changes came in the form of teaching. After his lecture went viral, schools and community centers across Boston started reaching out, asking if Harold would be willing to share his story with their students. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking still made him nervous, and he worried about saying the wrong thing or coming off as preachy. But Dr. Carter encouraged him. "You don't have to be perfect," she told him. "Just be yourself. That's what inspires people." So Harold agreed, and soon he found himself standing in front of classrooms filled with wide-eyed kids. Some were teenagers dreaming of careers in science and engineering. Others were younger children who barely understood multiplication tables. Regardless of age, they all listened intently as Harold spoke. He didn't just talk about math, he talked about life. He shared stories of growing up poor, of dropping out of school to help his family, and of finding joy in small moments like solving puzzles during lunch breaks. He told them about the night he stood in front of that blackboard, unsure if anyone would ever notice what he'd done. And he reminded them that no matter where they came from or what challenges they faced, they had the power to create something meaningful. The kids loved him. They hung on his every word, raising their hands to ask questions or volunteering answers when he posed problems. One little girl, no older than 10, shyly approached him after a session. "Mr. Harold," she said, clutching a notebook, "can you sign this?" Harold smiled and obliged, scrawling his name alongside a quick equation. As he handed it back, she looked up at him with sparkling eyes. "I want to be a mathematician someday," she declared. Harold's chest swelled with pride. If his story could plant even one seed of possibility in a child's mind, then everything he'd been through was worth it. But it wasn't just the kids who benefited from Harold's newfound role. Adults, too, found inspiration in his journey. Local libraries began hosting events where Harold would give talks about perseverance and passion. Retirees, stay-at-home parents, and mid-career professionals alike attended, eager to hear how a man who spent decades working behind the scenes had managed to make such a profound impact. Many told Harold afterward that his story gave them hope, that it reminded them it's never too late to chase a dream or rediscover an old love. Of course, not everyone reacted positively. There were skeptics, people who questioned whether Harold truly deserved the recognition he was receiving. A few snarky online comments accused him of riding coattails or getting lucky. How can a janitor solve something PhDs couldn't? One commenter sneered. Harold brushed off these remarks, knowing they came from ignorance rather than malice. Besides, he had bigger things to focus on, like mentoring young minds and continuing his own research. Speaking of research, Harold's collaboration with Dr. Carter blossomed into something neither of them had anticipated. What began as a simple paper grew into ongoing projects exploring new applications of Harold's methods. Together, they tackled complex problems in topology, geometry, and even cryptography. Harold thrived in this environment, feeding off the energy of the team and relishing the chance to dive deeper into subjects he'd once studied alone in secret. His unconventional approach continued to yield surprising results, earning praise from experts around the globe. Harold also became a vocal advocate for accessible education. Having grown up without resources, he understood firsthand how difficult it could be for talented individuals to pursue their passions. During interviews and public appearances, he spoke passionately about the need to break down barriers and provide opportunities for underprivileged students. Math isn't just for the elite, he'd say. It's for anyone who loves patterns and problem solving. We need to stop telling kids they're not good enough before they even get a chance to try. His advocacy led to tangible change. A group of philanthropists, inspired by Harold's story, established a scholarship fund in his name. The Harold Jenkins Scholarship supported students from low-income backgrounds pursuing degrees in STEM fields. Each year, recipients were invited to a special ceremony where Harold personally congratulated them and offered words of encouragement. Seeing these young scholars beam with pride brought tears to his eyes. He knew exactly how it felt to have someone believe in you when no one else did. Perhaps the most transformative aspect of Harold's journey, however, was the reconciliation with his daughter. Their relationship had been strained for years, marked by misunderstandings and missed connections. But after seeing her father on television, hearing his voice crack with emotion as he spoke about regret and redemption, she realized how deeply he cared. Her letter marked the beginning of a healing process, one that unfolded slowly but steadily over time. They started meeting for coffee every Sunday, catching up on lost years. She told him about her job, her hobbies, her struggles. He shared stories from his past, opening up in ways he never had before. Slowly, the walls between them crumbled. One day, she brought her 2 children, Harold's grandchildren, to meet him. Watching them laugh and play tugged at something deep inside. Harold, family, he realized, was another puzzle he'd been afraid to solve. Now, finally, he was piecing it back together. By the end of the year, Harold decided it was time to retire from janitorial work. Not because he felt he was above it, the job had given him stability and purpose, but because he wanted to dedicate more time to teaching, mentoring, and researching. His last day at Harvard was bittersweet. Students and faculty gathered to thank him, presenting him with a plaque engraved with the words, **, to Harold Jenkins, a true genius who inspired us all. As he hugged colleagues and shook hands with students, Harold felt a lump rise in his throat. This place had been his home for so long, and leaving felt like saying goodbye to an old friend. Yet retirement didn't mean slowing down. If anything, Harold's schedule became busier. He traveled to conferences, gave keynote speeches, and visited classrooms across the country. He wrote articles for educational journals, sharing insights not just about math, but about life itself. And he continued, working with Dr. Carter, their partnership evolving into a lifelong friendship. Through it all, Harold remained humble. He never forgot where he came from or the hardships that shaped him. Fame hadn't erased his memories of struggle, it had deepened his gratitude for the opportunities he'd been given. Every morning as he sipped his coffee and prepared for the day ahead, he reminded himself of one simple truth. Life is full of surprises. Sometimes, all it takes is a single moment of courage, a decision to pick up a piece of chalk and write your heart onto a blackboard for the world to see the brilliance hiding within you. As the years rolled on, Harold Jenkins settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and extraordinary. Retirement hadn't slowed him down. In fact, it seemed to have given him wings. Each morning, he woke up before sunrise, brewed himself a strong cup of coffee, and sat by the window with a notebook in hand. Sometimes he scribbled equations. Other times, he jotted down thoughts about life, lessons learned, or stories he wanted to share. The quiet hours before the world stirred were his favorite part of the day, a time when he could reflect on how far he'd come. Harold's days were now filled with purpose. He spent much of his time mentoring students, traveling to schools, and giving talks at community centers. His message was simple but powerful. Don't let anyone tell you what you're capable of. If I can do it, so can you. He didn't just say these words, he lived them. Whether he was breaking down complex math problems for third graders or helping high school seniors prepare for college entrance exams, Harold poured his heart into every interaction. Kids adored him, teachers respected him, and parents thanked him for igniting a spark in their children they hadn't seen before. One of Harold's proudest achievements came when the scholarship fund established in his name began awarding its first recipients. At the inaugural ceremony held in a modest auditorium near Harvard, Harold stood on stage with tears in his eyes as each student walked up to receive their certificate. One young man, barely out of high school, stepped forward hesitantly. When Harold handed him the envelope, the boy whispered, "Thank you. You saved my future." Those 6 words hit Harold like a punch to the chest. For years, he'd carried the weight of missed opportunities and broken dreams. Now standing there, he realized he was helping rewrite someone else's story, one full of hope and possibility. The ripple effects of Harold's journey extended beyond classrooms and scholarships. His story inspired nonprofits and grassroots organizations to rethink how they supported underprivileged communities. A local group launched a program called Hidden Potential, aimed at identifying talents in overlooked individuals, whether it was math, art, music, or any other skill. They modeled the initiative after Harold's philosophy: everyone has something valuable to offer. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to notice. Back home, Harold's relationship with his daughter continued to heal. Their weekly coffee dates turned into family dinners, laughter-filled gatherings where grandchildren ran around while adults swapped stories about their week. One evening, sitting at the dinner table, his daughter leaned over and said softly, "Dad, I'm proud of you. Not because of the math or the fame, but because you never gave up. Even when things got hard, you kept going." Harold felt a lump rise in his throat. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I had to," he replied, "because deep down I knew I still had something left to give." That sense of purpose stayed with him as he entered his late 70s. Though his hair had turned completely gray and his hands weren't as steady as they used to be, Harold's mind remained sharp. He continued collaborating with Dr. Carter and her team, contributing ideas that pushed boundaries and sparked new discoveries. Together, they published several more papers, each one building on the last. Academics worldwide hailed Harold, not just as a mathematician, but as a visionary who challenged conventional thinking. Yet, despite all the accolades, Harold never lost sight of what truly mattered. Fame and recognition were nice, but they weren't why he got out of bed every morning. What drove him was the chance to make a difference, to leave the world better than he found it. And he did exactly that. One chilly autumn afternoon, Harold returned to the same lecture hall where his journey had begun. It had been nearly a decade since he'd first picked up that piece of chalk and solved the problem on the blackboard. Now, the room buzzed with energy as dozens of students filed in, eager to hear him speak. This time, though, Harold wasn't nervous. He climbed onto the stage, looked out at the sea of faces, and smiled. "Life is funny," he began, his voice warm and steady. "It throws curveballs when you least expect them. Sometimes it knocks you down so hard you think you'll never get back up. But here's the thing. Even in your darkest moments, there's always a glimmer of light. You just have to look for it." He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he told his story from growing up poor in rural Kentucky to discovering his love for math, from dropping out of school to finding unexpected success later in life. He spoke honestly about his struggles, his doubts, and his fears. But he also talked about the joy of solving puzzles, the thrill of learning something new, and the beauty of connecting with others through shared passions. When Harold finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. Students rushed to the front, bombarding him with questions and requests for autographs. One young woman lingered behind, clutching a tattered copy of an algebra textbook. "Mr. Harold," she said shyly, "this book belonged to my mom. She loved math, but she couldn't afford to go to college. Now I'm trying to finish what she started. Do you think maybe someday I'll be as good as you?" Harold's eyes softened. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You already are," he said firmly. "And trust me, you'll go farther than I ever did." By the time Harold left the lecture hall that evening, snowflakes were beginning to fall, dusting the ground with a thin layer of white. He pulled his coat tighter around him and took a deep breath, savoring the crisp air. As he walked home, he thought about everything he'd experienced, the hardships, the triumphs, the people whose lives he'd touched. He realized something profound. Greatness isn't measured by titles, degrees, or awards. It's measured by the impact you have on others. In the years that followed, Harold's health began to decline. Simple tasks became harder, and he eventually had to stop traveling. But even confined to his apartment, he stayed active. He wrote letters to aspiring mathematicians, offering advice and encouragement. He recorded videos for educational platforms, sharing tips and tricks for tackling tough problems. And he continued mentoring students remotely, guiding them through challenges big and small. When Harold passed away at the age of 82, the world mourned the loss of a remarkable man. Tributes poured in from every corner: students, professors, colleagues, strangers whose lives he'd touched. Headlines celebrated him as the janitor who changed mathematics forever. Yet, those closest to him remembered him not for his achievements, but for his kindness, humility, and unwavering belief in the potential of others. Today, Harold's legacy lives on. The scholarship fund bearing his name continues to support countless students, many of whom go on to achieve incredible things. Schools teach his methods in classrooms, using his story to inspire the next generation of thinkers. And somewhere, tucked away in a dusty corner of Harvard's math building, stands a blackboard with faint traces of chalk still visible, an eternal reminder of the night. A quiet janitor dared to dream. Harold Jenkins proved that greatness doesn't belong to the privileged few. It belongs to anyone brave enough to follow their passion, no matter the odds. His life was a testament to the power of perseverance, curiosity, and the human spirit. And though he may be gone, his story will continue to inspire for generations to come. After all, true brilliance isn't about being seen, it's about leaving a mark that lasts long after you're gone.